أعزائي المشاهدين، أهلا بكم في لقاء مع الدبلوماسي السابق المخضرم تشاز فريمان. السفير فريمان مؤلف وكاتب، خدم في وزارتي الخارجية والدفاع في مناصب متنوعة لمدة 30 عاما. خدم سفيرا في الرياض وكان مرافقا للرئيس نيكسون في زيارته الشهيرة للصين. يرأس المجلس السياسي للشرق الأوسط والمجلس السياسي الأميركي الصيني والمدير الدائم للمجلس الأطلسي. في فبراير عام 2009 تعرض لحملة انتقادية إعلامية منظمة من قبل مؤيدي إسرائيل بعد تسرب خبر عن نية الرئيس أوباما اختياره ليرأس المجلس القومي للاستخبارات، ولكنه طلب من الرئيس إعفائه من الاختيار بعد أن ندد بحملة الاغتيال المعنوي التي مارستها ضده دوائر اللوبي الصهيوني. من أبرز مؤلفاته المغامرات المتهورة للولايات المتحدة America's Misadventures in the Middle East. أيضا فنون القوة، حرفة الحكم والدبلوماسية، وقاموس الدبلوماسي، وأيضا له كتاب عن الأيام الهامة في الصين. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
A pleasure to be with you.
Ambassador, we're going to start with the current affairs.
Good.
The issue of Yemen.
Right.
It was somewhat surprising that the Saudi launched their attack. The United States said there is a unit in Riyadh that coordinate planning for it. What do you make of this?
Well, this is very new kind of behavior on the part of the Saudis. Historically, they have used money. They have been behind the scenes. They have done nothing violent or overt. But now they're doing this. I think Saudi Arabia is behaving in a much more assertive, independent fashion after the Arab uprisings. And the United States, I'm not sure whether the United States actually agreed at all with what the Saudis have done. But after some of the difficulties in U.S.-Saudi relations in recent years, and with the possible agreement with Iran looming before us, I think the United States felt it had no choice but to back the Saudis in this adventure.
But we heard lately that they halted their air attacks, but then they resume it. What do you think the outcome going to, how Saudi Arabia going to end up after this, and also United States position in the region and in the Gulf in particular?
Well, I think from the beginning it's not been clear exactly what the Saudis intended to do. Clearly they can do a lot of damage to Yemen, and they have done. They can make the Houthis hurt, and they have done. But they cannot reinstall the ousted government from the air. They cannot pacify Yemen in this manner. So I suppose in the end what it comes down to is a lesson to Yemeni politicians that there are limits to Saudi Arabia's patience, and that alignment with Iran will not be tolerated by the kingdom.
Do you see any outcome, political outcome of this, or what, or how is Saudi Arabia going to deal with the situation where there is a lingering crisis there that they were not able, as you suggested, to resolve? And while also Al-Qaeda and its affiliates are flourishing now, because in some way the Saudis are as if they are siding now with Al-Qaeda against Al-Houthi and their supporters.
Well, I think it's a very confusing picture. I don't think anyone knows how it is going to come out. But one thing is clear: if you destabilize a society, and attacking it from the air and facilitating civil strife within it does that, then you open the path for extremists to jockey for position. And so we have an increasingly confusing picture in Yemen. It's very unclear whether Yemen will survive as a unified state. It was, of course, two countries until 1990. It may again become two countries. And in the end, I think the Saudis are going to have to fall back on their traditional methods of money and quiet talk rather than the use of their air force to exercise influence in Yemen. But Yemen is now in a very dangerous condition, and the extremists are having a field day.
The issue of U.S. policy, the administration policy vis-a-vis what's going on in the region is really something people are puzzled about. Especially today, the Washington Post is talking about dual engagement policy. This is the new strategy for Obama administration versus something in the past, dual containment, when there was a war between Iraq and Iran. But in any case, there is series of statements made by Obama lately, somewhat critical of the GCC country in particular, and something about Libya, talking about you've seen them fan the flames of military conflict rather than try to reduce them. One other thing he also said, I think the biggest threat that they face may not be coming from Iran invading. It's going to be from dissatisfaction inside their own countries. Then he also mentioned something about Syria, and it's more puzzling when he say, why is that we can't have Arab fighting the terrible human rights abuses that have been perpetrated or fighting against what Assad has done? We could probably cite others in light of the upcoming summit. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the upcoming summit is important for several reasons. I was not an admirer of dual containment at all. I think we were far better off when we allowed natural balances of power in the region keep the peace. But dual engagement, it seems to me, has a number of implications. One is that there will be an opening to Iran. That's one of the engagements. The other is that the United States will take compensating action to be more engaged with its Arab security partners. I think the United States and the Gulf countries, the Gulf Arab countries, have a more distant, less intimate, less trusting relationship after recent events. One of the key moments was the fall of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, which I think sobered many of them in the Gulf as they saw the United States not stand by a traditional partner and friend, but allow him to come down. So I think since then they have been more inclined to make their own decisions, take their own risks, not rely on the United States. And the United States, for our part, has been more willing to be critical of them. So that's just the new reality, and we see that. And it seems to me President Obama is being quite realistic when he notes that there have been differences among the GCC countries on regional matters. For quite a while, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were barely on speaking terms, for example. Kuwait plays a role which many consider to be unhelpful in places like Syria, with a lot of money going to Daesh and other extremists from wealthy Kuwaitis. So there is a bit of confusion in the GCC. And I suppose in the end what the president is arguing is that problems like Daesh or the human rights abuses in Syria, whether they're from Daesh or from the government, ultimately are an Arab issue. And Arabs need to take responsibility for the problems in the Arab region and not depend on foreigners, outsiders, to act for them, as they have in the past. So I think he is suggesting a more distant U.S. involvement in the region, even as he suggests that we will be dealing both with Iran and with the GCC countries.
That distance, but at the same time, we see from the military operation conducted by the Saudis that they rely on many aspects of the United States. So to what extent this example could be a kind of a hint of what possibly can do on their own without relying on the United States?
Well, in the end, the countries in the region, whether they are Saudi Arabia or they are Israel, these countries all depend on resupply and support from the United States. That's unfortunate in my view, because very often it enables them to do things that are not necessarily in their own interest, because they have a feeling that whatever goes wrong, the United States will be there to help them pick up the pieces. Whatever munitions they expend will be resupplied by the United States. And one of the reactions to the instability in the region that has been very clear has been a huge surge in arms purchases by most of the countries in the region. That is to say, those who are able to buy weapons from outside. And we have quite an arms race going on. And I suppose the fact that Saudi Arabia is now by far the largest purchaser of weapons in the world, UAE is not far behind, reflects this. So does the recent Russian anti-air defense deal with Iran. This is a region which has become a focal point for conflict and arms races.
Well, you're talking about arms races, and there was some articles lately talking about that the United States actually is allowing more war to occur in the region because of, or that will benefit the United States from having this. But I want you to hold on that answer, and also of potential military intervention by GCC country, because especially there was some mentioning of Syria lately. Just hold that answer after we take a short break. أعزائي المشاهدين، سنتابع حوارنا مع السفير تشاز فريمان بعد فاصل قصير. ابقوا معنا. أعزائي المشاهدين، أهلا بكم مجددا. نتابع حوارنا مع السفير تشاز فريمان. Mr. Ambassador, we were talking about arms sales. As a matter of fact, New York Times said lately, sale of U.S. arms fuels the wars of the Arab states. Now, there is enormous benefit of U.S. military manufacture, and probably the economy in the United States could benefit from that. And some people suggest that the United States, even by tacit improvement or slight encouragement of the Saudis with this new war in Yemen, is also that side benefit is to fuel the arms and arms sales in the region.
Well, I imagine that the arms manufacturers are quite pleased with the increased sales that they have, but I don't think that drives U.S. government policy at all. I think the interesting thing here is that the very assertive, aggressive behavior that we've seen recently from some of the Gulf Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in particular, is extremely popular at home for them. And we have, in the case of Saudi Arabia, a new king. I think this is consolidating his authority, and one has to wonder to what extent domestic politics in Saudi Arabia play into this. Now, in the case of Syria, where the Saudis and the Syrian government are obviously now open enemies, I think in the case of Syria, the question is whether the Saudis, who have been looking for others to do the job of intervening in Syria, are now prepared to do something on their own. They're threatening to do it. the world is not necessarily, the region is not necessarily a safer place because the countries in it behave more independently, make their own judgments and take their own risks. And I think in some ways it's becoming quite explosive, and we don't know where this is going to go.
In the context of regional powers, you have Turkey, you have Iran, you have Egypt trying to get back into playing role, and you have the Saudi Arabia. You see now Saudi Arabia as if stepping up their position with an unusual means, like using military. So do you think they can afford to extend their military reach and involvement to go to Syria, even to intervene in Syria?
Well, I think they probably do have the capability to do a great deal more, but not through an invasion of Syria or anything of that sort, more covert action. I mean, the fact is that the Arab world has gone through a tremendous wrenching set of changes. Always in the Mashriq, the Arab East, you had three centers: Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. Well, Damascus is a wreck. Baghdad is flattened. Cairo is sidelined. Now we have Riyadh as the only major Arab capital that is asserting itself. And from the Saudi perspective, I suppose they feel they have no choice but to step into a power vacuum. Whether others in the region agree with that or not is another question.
But you alluded in one book about American misadventures.
Yes.
Now, the Saudis, they may have an illusion about extending their influence and their power in the region, and they may extend themselves to the extent that they will jeopardize the stability internally.
I've always felt that that it was a mistake for Saudi Arabia to define its foreign policy in sectarian terms. After all, for example, if Saudi Arabia wants to compete in Iraq for influence, it should do so. It has greater appeal doing so as an Arab country rather than as a Salafi country. The Salafi message is divisive in Iraq. To be an Arab is to be Iraqi, or at least for most Iraqis other than the Kurds and Turkmen. So I don't understand this choice on the part of the Saudis, but it has now gotten very much bound up in strategic rivalry with Iran, which of course is predominantly Shia. And it's gotten confused in Yemen with the other non-Sunni elements like Zaydis, who really don't have much in common with the Iranian Shia at all, but who have been driven, as it were, to look to Iran as an ally against the Saudis. So it's a very confusing situation, as I said, and it's one in which Saudi Arabia is taking significant risks. And when you take risks, sometimes they go wrong.
And the potential of going wrong.
It's there. The potential for Saudi Arabia to find itself in difficulty internally because of external misadventures is also there.
What do you expect from Obama to tell? He was talking about the difficult conversation with the GCC leaders when they meet next month. What kind of expectation they have, and what Obama, who is really a president but lame duck president actually, what kind of outcome you envision from this?
Part of this, I suspect, is short-term and tactical, and having to do with reducing the fallout from a possible agreement with Iran. If we are going to have a different relationship with Iran, this has implications for our relations with the GCC countries, and he will want to talk about that. I suppose that the U.S., which has always favored unity of effort and even unity of military command among the GCC, would like to see that.
How about military security pacts, new,
well, I think that's
collectively or...
I don't see the United States doing a treaty of alliance with the GCC, reaffirming our connection to the GCC generally, and our support for its security is very much on the agenda, I'm sure. The problem with the GCC is that it is not unified. The different countries have different perspectives, different interests. Many of them have historically been at odds with each other, and it isn't easy to forge a common front. But I suppose that's what the President will want to encourage.
What do you think of the chances of the agreement? You alluded to the agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue that's going to be reached. Is your belief that it is coming?
It's certainly achievable, and it's clear that that is the case. The outline of the agreement that we all know is there. It's not done, and it could yet fail, but on balance I think it's more likely to succeed than not.
With the minutes remaining of our short interview, I wish we could extend it, but we are limited with time. I want to discuss with you something that we alluded to in our introduction about you are the most qualified to take that position that Obama supposedly offered you but did not back you up when some criticism came from the Israeli lobby. What can you tell us about that experience?
Well, I spent 30 years serving my country, and I retired and was in business and enjoying my freedom of speech, which I did not have when I was in the government. So when I was approached about this job, I didn't want it. But in the end, when I was told, we need you, I guess a patriotic impulse kicked in, and I accepted. I warned the administration that there would be criticism from the Israel lobby. I didn't have any idea how intense it would be.
Or vicious.
Or vicious, yeah, very vicious, slanderous. But this has been their standard mode of operation. Basically, if they cannot argue rationally with someone, they try to destroy his reputation. And that's what they tried to do with me. And I think normally in the past, people have very quietly walked the plank and fallen into the water without a sound. I decided that I would go loudly and point the finger at them as I did so. And I think that was very useful. It has actually helped to open a discussion that had been closed in the United States. And now the whole tenor of the discussion about Israel and Zionism and Israel's behavior toward the Palestinians and toward its other Arab neighbors has changed. It's much more open, much more critical, much healthier, and I'd like to think I played a small role in accomplishing that.
To our people in the region, there is some exaggeration about the role and the influence and the power of the lobby. What do you think should happen in the United States? Is it healthy to continue to have that influence, and for people like you will be prevented from serving their own country?
Well, I think the lobby in a sense is destroying itself. It has become so blatant in its pulling of strings. The role of extremely wealthy individuals, Sheldon Adelson being the most notable, has become so obvious. The politicians' greed for campaign donations has become so disgusting that people are having a very serious reaction. And in the end, I don't think this can be sustained. Mr. Netanyahu's visit to Washington, his attempts to manipulate American domestic politics against Obama, his intervention in the Iran negotiations, have all drawn widespread opposition. And I would note that some of the most, the fiercest opposition comes from Jewish Americans. They do not believe Mr. Netanyahu has any right to speak for them, or that he has any right to interfere in American politics. They are Americans. They may be Jewish, but they are loyal Americans, and they are insulted by his behavior. So in the end, I think the lobby will do itself in. But it will take a lot of people with it as it goes. Maybe I'm one.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this interview, and hopefully we can have more exchanges in the near future. أعزائي المشاهدين، شكرا جزيلا لحسن استماعكم، وسيكون لنا لقاءات مع شخصيات في المستقبل. شكرا لكم.